A few weeks ago, Resident Evil Death Island finally released on Blu-ray and streaming services, and with it came the long-awaited return of Jill Valentine. Formerly, Jill's latest appearance on the Resident Evil timeline had been Resident Evil 5, which released all the way back in 2009. After 14 years of waiting and now multiple viewings of the movie, I unfortunately have to say that this movie fails miserably at giving Jill a worthy comeback. Instead, it completely destroys her personality while ignoring previous stories and failing to justify her new attitude as well as her actions. The character in this movie may be called Jill Valentine, but this is not the same person. Jill originally appeared in 6 games spread across the Resident Evil timeline. From a young police officer in Raccoon City to a dedicated fighter against bioterrorism in the ranks of the BSAA, Jill went on quite a journey. It all started for her with Resident Evil 1 and its remake, which was set in 1998, Resident Evil 3, which takes place a few months later in the same year, The Umbrella's End chapter from The Umbrella Chronicles, set in 2003, Resident Evil Revelations in 2005, and lastly, Resident Evil 5's DLC chapter Lost in Nightmares, set in 2006, as well as the main game set in 2009. Throughout all of these appearances, both Jill's design and personality stay rather consistent. She is warm and kind, with a lot of empathy for those around her.
Barry!
Forgive me.
No, you're not to blame. It's Umbrella and Wesker.
Even if it meant my family, I couldn't bear turning my back on my friends again.
Sorry. I feel so useless.
Don't. You fought hard and have the wounds to prove it.
But I'm still alive. My men aren't.
Don't think about that now. Just rest.
Jill. Jill. Are you all right?
Chris. I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
You're Sheva, right?
Yes.
I couldn't control my actions. Oh, but God, I was still aware. Oh, forgive me.
It's all right.
Thank you. You got room for one more?
There's always room for a beautiful lady.
I bet you say that to all the girls.
Just the pretty ones. Come on, let's go.
Given her evolution from police officer to soldier, she is also defined by her focus, discipline, and ability to keep a level head in tough situations. Outside of a brief time where she's under mind control by Albert Wesker, Jill doesn't waver much in her personality. Even being mind controlled didn't break her spirits, as evident in the Resident Evil 5 Desperate Escape DLC. She pretty much returns to her former self once the P30 device is removed. The last time we heard about her was in Resident Evil Revelations 2, released in 2015, in which an email she sent to Barry Burton can be unlocked as a bonus item. The tone and style of the email are very much in line with Jill's established personality, and it seems that she's doing okay after the events of Resident Evil 5. Now, all of this brings us to the Resident Evil 3 remake, which was released in 2020. This game introduced a version of Jill Valentine that felt like a completely different person. To a degree, this was expected, given that Capcom defines their recent remakes as reimaginings. However, the changes to Jill go way further than any other character. Compared to the original Jill, this new version feels like an immature teenager. She's angry, loud, constantly throws curses and insults around, and consistently taunts Nemesis, who is supposed to be an intimidating foe. She seems to have very little control over her emotions and makes some incomprehensible decisions.
I am UBCS platoon leader Mikhail Viktor. My team was sent here to rescue civilians.
Right. How's that going for you?
You'll have to circle around through an alley to your right to get there.
You mean the alley that's on fire?
Maybe. Surely a tall drink of water like yourself can put out a few flames.
Fuck you. All right, let's do this. Suck it! It's done. Give me the vaccine, you greedy son of a bitch!
No.
Look, just so you know, this is the last fucking time. Go ahead! I'm gonna put you right back on your ass. You think I don't know how to fuck you up?
Of course, original Jill also had moments of anger or frustration, and she did curse a handful of times over the course of multiple games, but it was always situational and not her defining personality trait. Long story short, this reimagined Jill has barely anything in common with the original Jill. The Resident Evil 3 remake received a lot of criticism, including for its portrayal of Jill Valentine. However, Resident Evil Death Island was already in production at the time, and the writer Mr. Fukami has stated that he was playing the remake while writing the movie. So not only did the remake influence this movie's version of Jill, but furthermore, any feedback for the remake was probably not taken into account, and that unfortunately is rather evident. Before I get to Jill's personality and actions in the movie, I would like to take a moment to focus on her design. In Resident Evil 5, Jill went through quite a few visual changes. Her hair became blonde and her skin turned pale as a result of Albert Wesker's experiments on her. The removal of the P30 device also caused some pretty serious wounds, which would have definitely left some scars. Now, none of this is present on the Death Island Jill model. The producers decided to reuse the Resident Evil 3 remake model without any alterations to Jill's appearance, despite the fact that the remake and the movie take place 17 years apart. Any visual consistency is ignored. The explanation given in interviews is that they were worried people would not recognize Jill if they made changes to her most recent design. Because I guess only the most recent games count in the minds of marketing people and producers. We have also learned by now that a different Jill model and design were considered, but ultimately discarded for the same reason. The marketing campaign claimed that Jill is aging slower now due to her exposure to the T-virus, but this is not actually brought up in the movie and feels like marketing bullshit to justify the asset reuse. So all of this brings us to the main point of contention, Jill's personality and her behavior in this movie. I would like to start by saying that this is not a continuation of the Jill Valentine we left behind in that chopper at the end of Resident Evil 5 so many years ago. This is simply a reuse of the reimagined version from Resident Evil 3 remake, and somehow they have managed to make her even more insufferable this time around. Let's take a look at some of the scenes that perfectly prove that point. Jill appears first in the movie outside of a residential building, and Chris is telling her over comms to wait for the rest of the team.
Jill, come in.
Go for Jill.
Based on first reports, this looks like a bioweapon situation. Cordon off the street and wait for backup.
Too late. I'm inside, checking for survivors.
Don't go rushing in. Wait for backup. That's it.
Ignoring her orders, Jill makes her way into the building, which eventually leads to a close call encounter with an infected civilian. Shortly after, Chris and his team show up, and Chris confronts Jill for going in alone.
Why'd you go in alone?
I'm not waiting for backup when there's a chance someone's in danger.
Right, but...
This scene already makes it crystal clear what version of Jill Valentine we're dealing with here. She's cold and angry, her voice is harsh, and she seemingly has no concern for discipline. She wanted to go in, so she ignored Chris and risked compromising the mission. The professionalism with which original Jill handled herself is entirely absent. In the next scene, we see Chris talk to Rebecca about Jill. He says he's making her write the report on the mission, to which Rebecca remarks,
"Ah, I get it. Punishment."
Chris is very unhappy with Jill's actions and vents his frustration. Rebecca, however, says it's understandable, given what she's been through, and that Chris is being too hard on her.
Jill wasn't bitten, was she?
No. Just being reckless. As usual.
Why are you so hung up on that? After all she's been through, she's finally back in the field. If she's being reckless, like you say, it's probably because she's trying to make up for what happened to her.
You mean how Wesker brainwashed her and made her come after us? No one's blaming Jill for that.
No one. Except Jill.
So yeah, Rebecca seems to believe that ignoring orders and compromising missions is okay for Jill to do because she feels bad due to the events from 6 years ago. Which begs the question, if her personal issues are really still unresolved and impact her ability to do her job, then why is she back in the field, where lapses in judgment can get people around her killed? Now, even Chris seems to be surprised that Jill is still hung up on the Wesker situation, which raises another question. Has he not talked to her in the last 6 years? We now find Chris and Jill at a shooting range. Chris wants to take Jill off the case, which is basically just a way to stoke conflict between the two characters, and is never brought up again after this scene. He tries to reach out to Jill, but she brushes off his concerns and gets mad at him.
What's up?
I want you off this case. You need some time off.
You're joking.
Chris attempts to reason with her, bringing up Pierce from Resident Evil 6. But Jill doesn't care and basically throws it in his face.
There was this guy named Pierce. I wanted him to take over after me. I trusted him, and he trusted me. He fought alongside me, then he died to save me.
The way Jill Valentine reacts to Chris Redfield, her supposedly close friend who is opening up to her about his own traumatic memories, breaks my heart a little bit more every time I see it.
We've been in this fight for so long. We're getting numb to it. So we have to be even more careful now. Because if we're not, that numbness will burn right down to our souls.
Innocent people are being poisoned and used as weapons. Whoever's doing that has no soul. And if we want to stop them, we can't afford to think about being numb or souls or any of that shit. At least I can't.
Hey, come on, Jill. Don't...
Her tone of voice in this scene almost comes off as hostile. This is the most out-of-character behavior for original Jill I could have ever imagined. The scene eventually ends with Jill returning to her shooting. This is the first on-screen heart-to-heart between these two characters in 14 years, and everything is disjointed. No attempt is made here to give us an idea of how we went from the warm and kind Jill at the end of Resident Evil 5 to this cold, angry, immature teenager who treats one of the most important people in her life like garbage. No amount of personal pain ever justifies treating those around you poorly, especially not if those people care about you. However, Chris doesn't push back against Jill's behavior, and the movie never holds her accountable for it in any way. Using trauma as an explanation for behavior makes no sense to me. First of all, we saw Jill in Resident Evil 5 after the removal of the P30 device, and she was back to her original personality. Furthermore, the tone of the email in Resident Evil Revelations 2, which takes place after RE5, was entirely in line with her original personality as well. This further degrades the trauma argument because she would have already been dealing with it at that point in time. There is no story here, just a jarring disconnect with the continuity of Resident Evil 5 and Revelations 2. No effort is being made to explain how we went from Jill being okay to her seemingly being so unstable that it impacts her ability to do her job. This whole conversation also feels like Chris and Jill are just vaguely acquainted co-workers who haven't spoken to each other in years. I find it impossible to believe that Chris spent 3 years searching for Jill just to find her, free her, and then not check up on her in rehab on a regular basis. He would have definitely helped her process past events while keeping her up to date on happenings at the BSAA. Chris and Jill are close friends and trusted partners. There's no way they just stopped talking to each other for over half a decade. Jill is trying to lure the mutated Dylan towards her with this exquisite line of dialogue.
You kill everyone because you feel guilty for killing your friend? Deal with it yourself, asshole!
Mocking another person's trauma feels like a weird thing to do for someone who is allegedly dealing with trauma herself. Jill in this movie is not the original Jill Valentine, but just the angry, reimagined version from Resident Evil 3 Remake. Her behavior has nothing to do with trauma, storytelling, or character development. It is simply who she is. A totally different character who fails to recapture even a fragment of what made the original such a beloved character and role model. They wanted to put Jill in the movie, but it wasn't a priority to do it well. So they took RE3R Jill both in personality and design, put her in the movie and explained the disconnect with trauma, and she doesn't age anymore. No effort was made to acknowledge previously established stories or attempt to bridge the gap between them and this movie. Such an important character in this franchise deserved a timeline-accurate 3D model and a carefully written continuation of her last canonical appearance. Death Island should have been OG Jill's exciting return after 14 years of absence, but instead, the angry, reimagined version showed up to the party and ruined everything. Thank you very much for watching.